Hello, everybody. I am Emilee Gilpin, and I'm the managing editor of IndigiNews. Thank you first to the organizers for putting together this event and making space for this important conversation that I'm grateful to be a part of. Thank you to the panelists for sharing their good insights and everyone who's joining in today or catching this later. I'm a mixed person and I go by she, her pronouns. I'm Métis, a member of the Manitoba Métis Federation and Filipina through my father, and third and fourth generation settler with Irish, Scottish, and British ancestry on my mother's side. I grew up in southwestern Ontario and have lived and traveled a little bit of everywhere for over a decade. I'm currently a visitor on the traditional and unceded territories of the Wasanich Nation on so-called Vancouver Island. When I'm not working, I train in capoeira, Muay Thai, and street self-defense, which helps me travel alone as a journalist. I participated in a graduate course in journalism at Concordia University in 2016, where it became glaringly apparent to me that the state of journalism in North America was in need of tender love and care. It was a time when people were saying journalism as we knew it was dying, that there were no more jobs for journalists, and the more that I learned about the state of the industry and the culture of newsrooms across North America, the more I felt, so be it, down with the old and in with the new, or in with the old, which I'll elaborate on. Due to my family history and lived experiences, as well as my education and training on anti-oppression and anti-racism, I wasn't surprised that all of my professors were white, mostly male, and that I was being taught colonial journalism with a low ethical bar for the communities that people wanted to work with. Walking through the press room in Canada's Parliament building a few years later while reporting on a historic apology delivered to the Tethcotin Nation for the wrongful hanging of 6 of their war chiefs, I peered at photos of Canada's founding fathers of journalism, old white men that looked, thought, and talked nothing like me. The more I looked with intention at journalism schools and newsrooms across the country, the more I saw how much harm mainstream media could and has caused, exploiting people, perpetuating trauma porn, repeating harmful stereotypes, and writing inaccurate depictions of people and places that they claim to want to cover. Seeing Red, a heavily researched book by Carmen Robertson and Mark Anderson, does a fantastic job of outlining how Canada's history of English-speaking newspapers were used to outline and support a colonial agenda. Newspapers used as an arm of the state, written by one demographic of people. All of us here today know the importance of newspapers in defining reality, outlining truth, documenting history. So I started to look more deeply at whose voices were missing or severely misrepresented, and how, if I was going to get involved in this media machine, was I going to be a part of changing that. I started giving workshops at Concordia to other journalism students and communication staff, as well as other newsrooms over the years, providing tools and techniques on how to avoid oppressive words and ideologies, decenter the colonial gaze on colonial legal systems, beliefs, and perspectives, and perpetuating false narrative and homogenous narratives of diverse peoples. We explored how Indigenous storytelling, news sharing, and oral traditions are still alive and well and can provide ethical standards of practice for any storyteller today. I called these workshops Decolonizing Journalism. I spoke up in my class and corrected my professors at times, walked out during a class on the TRC that only showcased Stephen Harper's court-mandated apology and offered no critical insight into the attempted genocide of Indigenous peoples or forced assimilation policies that trickled down through my family. I felt shunned and shamed at times for challenging the standard of practice and was told by multiple so-called journalism experts that I wouldn't get a job because I wasn't objective enough. And yet I was the only person from my graduate cohort to get a job right out of the gate. I interned with the Tyee for a summer, focusing mostly on a series of profiles of urban Indigenous women, and then took a job with National Observer, leading their First Nations Forward series dedicated to stories of strength and success in Indigenous communities across BC. I hustled to try and get out Indigenous voices, be a vehicle for people to speak for themselves for once, rather than be spoken about by people with completely different life experiences, worldviews, and cultural context. I stayed in Brazil in 2019 after my sister's wedding, where I did some freelance reporting, but a lot of witnessing and listening, inspired by grassroots media and activism across Central and South America. I started a Facebook Live series as soon as the pandemic took off last year, hearing from Indigenous scholars, activists, elders, masters, leaders, and community members, and then was offered this fantastic role with IndigiNews to be the managing editor and help support a new wave of Indigenous journalists. IndigiNews was created through a partnership through APTN and The Discourse. The goal of the partnership was to provide journalism that serves and is driven by what local communities say they want, and to experiment with new business models for digital local news that contributes to the long-term sustainability of independent Indigenous news in Canada. Discourse Media, already an impact-driven independent media platform, planted the seeds for IndigiNews, attaining funding through the Local Journalism Initiative. We hired 3 journalists in the Okanagan and 4 across Vancouver Island, some part-time and some full. It has been quite a year. We've been out here raising the ethical bar on how to report on Indigenous stories, training people with little to no journalism experience rather than saying there's not enough Indigenous journalists to hire or no one applied. We set up a mini journalism boot camp in school, brought in seasoned Indigenous journalists while pumping out as many stories as we could, giving meat to the bones of the saying representation matters. We ran a series on reproductive health last year that included an investigation into the practice of birth alerts and internal documents that revealed legal experts warned MCFD that the practice was unconstitutional, triggering pressure on the industry that has been likened to the residential school system. As a team of Indigenous mothers, aunties, community members who wear many hats, we've cried, laughed, and fought together. We created a new newsroom culture at IndigiNews, a nurturing and supportive environment that values the well-being of our employees rather than glamorizing capitalism and patriarchy. IndigiNews claims to be a media outlet that you can trust. Due to the colonial history of newspapers in Canada, it's not a surprise that trust has needed to be built up again, and we are doing just that. We practice trauma-informed, anti-oppressive journalism, self-locating on certain topics, working with our sources on care plans. We're a place where community members can see themselves reflected and represented accurately. We're filling in gaps of coverage, sharing voices of people on the ground. We lost a large part of our LGI funding when contracts weren't renewed and weren't able to keep on our whole team. But while we've downsized, we've continued on and gotten creative. We consistently discuss and address our intentions. Is it to get likes, views, and awards? Or are we here to tell the truth, to show up when it matters, to amplify Indigenous voices in the ecosystems and relatives that we're closely tied to change the harmful narratives that have been caked into this country's colonial conscience, to document the many faces of this unfolding story, and to make a difference in our communities on the ground? We continue to find ways to generate steady revenue, to grow, adapt, and evolve, and hopefully have a presence in communities across the country as we continue to grow. We've only been here for over a year. I wonder where we're gonna go from here. So check out IndigiNews if you haven't already. Subscribe, support, and follow on our journey. I'm happy to share more about some of the opportunities we've had to collaborate with aligned organizations. Journalism isn't going anywhere. As speakers have touched on tonight, we have come far from where we've been, but there is still work to do to create a higher standard of accuracy and accountability in the press. I have said for the past years that the media is in a stage of metamorphosis, and we have an opportunity to change and strengthen the culture of the industry in order to support its sustainability. I see everyone here doing that tonight in their own way, and I'm proud and grateful to be a part of these changing tides. Hi, thank you.